So hi, I'm Don DeLoach. I'm the founder and managing partner of Rocket Wagon Venture Studios. My background is basically all technology and mostly data focused. And for the last 20 years, I've been running a few small venture-backed companies. Again, largely focused on data and the curation and use and consumption of data. I am very, very passionate about IoT. For the last 10 years, IoT has been kind of my work day and my hobby. I was involved in starting the Midwest IoT Council and the Midwest IoT Studios, and I'm involved in a number of different companies and boards around IoT. And between my passion for IoT and my passion for startups, that led me to Rocket Wagon Venture Studios and has me sitting here with Haven and Betsy today.
Thanks, Don. And I'll turn it over to you, Betsy.
Thanks, Haven. Great to be here. Hi, Don, and wonderful to join you today. I'm Betsy Ziegler. I'm the CEO of 1871. 1871 is an digital innovation hub in Chicago. We support companies across the full maturity curve, from those that have an idea through product market fit, through the growth stage, and through corporate and enterprise. We have a IoT Leadership Council made up of many leaders around Chicagoland that convene and think about the major issues supporting the IoT space, which helps them lead their work with their corporate, but also helps them advise our younger companies. And it's a pleasure to join the conversation. Thank you.
Perfect. And my name is Haven. I lead an organization called mHUB. It's a hard tech innovation center that's just over 4 years old, headquartered in Chicago. We support companies in building and launching physical product-based businesses. We also have a program called Accelerated Incubation and the Product Impact Fund, in which we make very early stage investments in the companies. To get this conversation started off, I'm just going to help moderate and tease out some questions in this, but should have a good open dialogue going between all three of us. But Don, I'll kick it off with you. What are the big trends you're seeing in early stage IoT currently?
Yeah, thanks, Haven. A few, I'll touch on them at a high level. So one is that over time, there's growing recognition about the importance of data in IoT. I can remember when I first started interacting with companies that were in the space, and I would say, yeah, that sounds really cool. What about the data? And they almost invariably, they would say, yeah, data is really important. We're just not there yet. And this was like back in 2013, 2014. Well, there's been growing recognition of the importance of data. But the other thing is, I think one of the trends you see is this movement of the lens from a connected product, peer-to-peer, to a product system. And one day we will get to system of systems. That's the buzzword. Everybody wants to go around and say system of systems. The system of systems really infers that you have heterogeneous devices that are negotiating with each other, and we aren't really there yet. But from a product system standpoint, the importance of architecture, the importance of understanding the underlying elements and the interdependencies between the elements with a given solution that's being brought to market, and then the real importance of the data within that architecture. So how do you create the data? How do you separate the creation from the consumption? How do you cleanse and enrich that data? How do you apply a governance model to propagate it to the various constituents? The illustration I use is that same that same temperature reading coming off the low-fat fryer in the fast food restaurant is probably going to go to the store operator, but it's going to go to the corporate offices and the headquarters. It's going to go to the supply chain partners. It's going to go to the product manufacturer who made the low-fat fryer. It's probably going to go to government regulatory bodies that are overseeing health and safety. It's still the same temperature reading. So thinking about the overall system holistically is really important. And just a couple other quick ones. One of them is, so what do you do with the data? I have so many friends in the IoT fraternity, if you will, that talk about AI and machine learning as the holy grail. And they are right. That's what gives us adaptive systems. But the AI and machine learning models are only going to be as good as the data you curate. So the quality of the data set contributes to the quality of the outcome from the analytic models. And so that's why we have to take a holistic view of the importance of that architecture. And then I guess the last thing I would say is there's a trend in the market where buyers of technology are becoming more and more interested in outcomes and less interested in the specifics of the underlying tech stack. That doesn't mean the underlying tech stack isn't important. It is. It just means that the quality of the underlying tech stack is evolving to the point where that's being abstracted from the lens of the buyer of the technology. They're trying to buy outcomes. They want something as mundane as the restroom operations in an airport to work effectively because you're pressing the button of the smiley face, right? So nobody thinks about that as a sophisticated application, but what happens underneath might be way more sophisticated than you think. So I think these are all sort of trends that we're seeing, but they kind of all anchor around this more holistic view of the architecture and the elements.
You know, staying on the, sorry, Betsy, just staying on trends. 1871 works with hundreds of startups every year. What sort of emerging market opportunities are you seeing, and where teams are really able to build a product, scale it, and get industry engaged with those opportunities?
Yeah, and Haven, if I'll answer that question. I'm just going to do one tiny little bridge from Don's point around data. I mean, I think one of the most exciting areas of opportunity with respect to IoT is the data. The complexity is increasing dramatically, right, in the short term, particularly for those that don't have the infrastructure and sort of the way to harness it and solve problems. But it's not about, for me, it's not about how do you get like incrementally better. It's how do you use that data completely transform the way you might imagine solving the problem. And so I'm looking forward, and then I'll get to your specific question, Haven, in just a second, but looking forward to that as an outcome. And so Don, I agree with everything that you said. It's just when you look at the amount of the world's data, right, it's doubling on an annual basis now, and over time it might be on a daily basis as more and more of these senses are connected. And just like, what do you do with it that drives good, right? And I just think there's so much opportunity there. Haven, with respect to your question, there's a couple of areas that we see a big growth with respect to IoT, and also I think the coupling of where the technology is, as well as what this last 14 months that literally the whole globe has gone through together in the pandemic. So on the healthcare side, we anticipate a massive increase in IoT with respect to healthcare, with wearables that provide virtual care, remote monitoring, right? A huge increase in remote monitoring inside of hospitals and taking care of the COVID patients that we think will probably continue to carry over. That's number one. Number two, I think when you look at how IoT has been used in the employee space, a shift from maybe productivity mapping to more of and energy consumption to more on the health and safety side. We'll see. I'm hopeful that we won't have to be 6 feet separated from everybody for the rest of our professional lives. But in the short term, I think that's going to play a big role, and potentially continued contact tracing and fingers crossed, hopefully not for another massive pandemic. And the last thing I would mention is as you think about interacting with your favorite brands, I think the increase in location-based services is going to be on the rise. We've certainly seen it with curbside pickup and some things that have happened in retail, but I think that the consumer push on that end, because a lot of us have enjoyed that, is the redesign of experiences with our brands that are going to be enabled because of where the where IoT technology, with coupling with the data to give them that insight, is.
It's interesting. We hear a lot from our industry partners that they're drowning in data, and they have all this great artificial intelligence and extracting whatever information they can, but they're still trying to drive further and further in IoT, not necessarily to get more data, but to create unique data sets.
Yeah.
And that's where artificial intelligence becomes powerful, when you have a unique and informed data set in which you can activate against it. Nowadays, there's so many ways and opportunities and sensors to capture those unique data sets for a very specific purpose. And I would say, yeah, in med tech, we're seeing a lot of opportunity, property technology,
Sure.
And then with advanced manufacturing in general. I think, again, going back to lessons learned in the last 14 months, we had a complete failure in a global supply chain. And there's a whole drive into creating greater level of visibility and efficiency in that supply chain. And I think there are a wave of investments that are going to come behind that. With data, though, there's issues with privacy and security. I mean, Don, I would love to have you, tease out about, some of the advancements on privacy front, on the security front, but where do we have to go to really get to a real secure set of Internet of Things economy?
It's a great question. So on both the security and the privacy front. I think from a security standpoint, we have to start with a mentality that would suggest that if we ever think we have the problem nailed, then we've really run the car into the ditch. It is an ongoing process. It is not something that has an endpoint. I also believe that the whole idea that there's a silver bullet to solve all the security problems is misleading. I think most people would suggest that a layered security model is a best practice in terms of how you think about it. So it's not just what's the attack vector, is the data in motion, or is it at rest? But I mean, the biggest example I can give in terms of IoT with regard to security is that a lot of large organizations that talk about how they are embracing IoT and cyber physical transformation talk about their IoT security in the context of extending their sort of CISO-based enterprise security policy. But a lot of those policies make assumptions that, for example, you have constant power sources to the device, because the end device is like a PC or a laptop of some sort. And with IoT, you have M0, M3 type devices that have a lithium-ion battery that are stuck underneath a bridge, and a lot of times just the security protocol for sending that message to the first point of reception, which is probably a gateway device, they're not, first of all, probably doesn't even have an IP address. And there are limitations as to what you can do in terms of bandwidth and payload. But these have to be considered. And when I have this conversation with people and they say, well, I mean, but it's just a thermometer. Why would anybody care, what type of data comes from the thermometer? You have to ask the question, what happens to the data? So if the thermometer is taking a reading on a multi-million-dollar asset, and because the reading is wrong, it shuts down the asset, and it shuts down the plant, and it costs millions and millions and millions of dollars, that's a bad thing. Might want to think about securing that device a little bit better. And that's just one example of a myriad of examples of where I see that there's a growing need for and recognition that there needs to be a better security model. Regarding privacy, that's a whole different discussion. And it has certain sort of societal, ethical considerations as well. So you see things like GDPR and many other similar policies being put in place around the world. But I would argue that sometimes when there's a big challenge, it prompts the market to come up with creative big responses. So like when we had the financial crisis and clearinghouses were under a much bigger burden of how they cleared trades, smart people came up with great ideas for how to make that easier and more accessible. There's a company I know in New York, I just know some of the founders, who have a company called Ananos, where they pioneered this process called dynamic pseudonymization. And the idea is that you can have GDPR level compliance, but then reconnect the context beyond what would be normal for GDPR by using this whole key structure that complies with GDPR under certain conditions. So you're combining the privacy and the authentication. This type of thinking is going to become pervasive as we move towards system of systems, and we need to protect this stuff. And the other thing I would say is the idea that all of this data may fall into the hands of 8 to 10 companies around the world, that's going to create a level of instability, because data is going to be the asset that we care about. So if we care about like the UN SDGs and doing good for society, we have to recognize the direct correlation between the evolution of this technology and be good stewards of the technology. And I think that needs to be a part of the fabric of what we're teaching people and talking about, including discussions with the startups that we're working with.
I mean, those are great examples of problems that a startup in the IoT space needs to address in order to build a scalable and sustainable businesses. I mean, Betsy, are there any others that you're seeing, particularly that early stage companies need to address as they're building an IoT startup?
Yeah, I have 3 or 4 that I have been thinking about. One is blanket across any kind of startup, IoT or others, but it's just a reminder for people to always have clarity of who is it for and what is it for, right? If you can't answer those 2 questions, then I would encourage before you spend any money or doing any significant build out that you're able to clearly articulate those things. Not that they won't change a little bit over time, certainly, but having deep clarity on that. So that's just a blanket one. The second one is, it's easy to get excited about lots of features and to go way up on and being super innovative on the feature curve. And that can be cheaper in a digital environment than it might be in an IoT environment. And so I focus really hard on what is the least functional, least capable implementation that you can do that is commercially viable to get people engaged. And coupled with that, I would think about what are the things that you can use that are off the shelf, right? Sort of the convergence of you're building this piece, but what can you use that are off the shelf or you're not designing all of your own components, or at least for that initial phase. Over time, you might want to cost engineer the supply chain out of it, but I would keep that in mind. And the last 2 things I would just say quickly are a lot of I invested in an IoT company. It was one of my first ever angel investments. I did it in 2012, who immediately started building overseas. And I would just think hard about vetting the cost overseas so you understand what that is, but build local to start and reduce that complexity. And I think coupled with some of Don's comments about both security and privacy, different countries are going to have different perspectives on some of these elements that may end up hurting you longer term. And the very last thing I'll say, Haven, is that being a great engineer and developing a great product is awesome. But if you don't have a great user experience and you can't tell your story well, it's not going to help you. And so I would make sure that there's at least somebody on the team that's focused on the UX, and maybe that same person or additional person is a really good writer.
Don, is there anything you'd want to add in? And I know we talk a little bit about like the connectivity chaos that's out there. I mean, you touch upon 5G, LoRaWAN, other ways, other methods in which you would potentially connect the device to the internet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, there's no one right answer. I think anybody would be remiss if they didn't take 5G seriously. It is legit, and it's going to become a key part of the landscape. But otherwise, I think that there's also a class of use cases that are very low bandwidth, very low payload, and using things like unlicensed spectrum like LoRaWAN, where it's a much more viable choice for a given class of solutions. So again, it's like, if I'm out cycling, I'm not going to go on the highway because that really wasn't what that was intended for. I'm going to go on a bike path. Conversely, if I'm in my car, the bike path's a pretty bad choice at that point, especially to the other bikers. So I think that there are a variety of options out there, and there's always more. But you will see some gravitation towards largely accepted approaches that will make sense. And to Betsy's point, the idea is that you want accessibility, speed to market, and something that is if you're a startup, you also have to think about, am I building something that might fit into a larger organization if I get to the point where I'm going to look at an M&A transaction instead of going public, which is the highest probability outcome. So yeah, these standards that are emerging and continue to emerge really should be taken seriously in terms of how startups build out what they're doing.
You know, the teams here at mHUB, you know, we're starting to work with them and really pivot some of our focus on supply chain. And Betsy, you kind of teased out upon this, but you know, there's sort of an impending crunch that is coming quickly, whether it's access to chips, plastic, steel, and you know, some of these are driven by, you know, the evolving sort of demand on technology. You know, the huge emergence of electric vehicles, you know, gobbling up a lot more of the componentry, but then just instability or, you know, acts of God like Texas freezing over, and that slows up our the plastic supply chain. And I think, you know, obviously we saw supply chain crunches early on during the pandemic. This one's going to be a whole lot different. And when we talk to teams about which parts and components they pick in, it's like, don't pick the one with all the bells and whistles. Pick the one that gets you the feature set you need, that you will have access to, knowing that you're working in small quantities, and the bigger players will always move up in the line ahead of you on the supply side. And your teams are going to need to be patient, I think, over the next 6 to 9 months with their production schedules and bake that into their startup sort of timeline. I don't know if you're seeing anything on that on either ends from the types of companies you're working with.
Either one of us?
Yeah.
I think my experience would, you know, as you know, we're not the chief partner in companies that are building physical products, right? But we certainly hear about that with members building products that are dependent on other pieces, right? But I think you're going to have way more. You have way more members that are dealing with that as a constraint on their ability to get to market than we do.
Yeah. First of all, Chicago, it should be noted, is kind of an epicenter for supply chain, like the transportation and distribution companies here. It is sure. Definitely an asset that we're proud of here in Chicago. There is a trend across the broader cyber physical transformation of systems moving towards decentralized distributed systems. There's a reason for that. It creates agility. It lends itself to much more resilient systems, whether you're talking about energy, whether you're talking about how supply chains are configured. The underlying agility to adapt and conform is enhanced by the ability to break apart these systems. And technology is allowing these supply chains to be broken apart like that. And then you see adjacent technologies, things like 3D printing, where, I mean, think of a construction site that gets held, a vertical construction site, 70 stories, and you've got tons of money going in there. And all of a sudden, everything shuts down because you're missing a key part that holds everything up.
Yep.
What happens when you can print that part on site? I mean, the capabilities go far and wide, and the creativity of people that are lending themselves to solving these problems. But I would say they begin to trend towards, again, decentralized distributed systems will be an overriding theme that you're going to see in a lot of these systems.
Perfect. And you know, we're starting to get to the end of time here, but just what's one piece of advice you would give a new startup in the IoT space?
I already kind of went through my laundry list. I guess I'll just do one quick reminder. Maybe it might be repetitive, but just fall in love with the problem that you're solving, not the way to solve the problem. And again, that could be used for IoT or anything else, but be really passionate about whatever problem you're solving. Make sure you understand who you're solving that problem for.
Yeah, 100%. That passion has to come through. The other thing I would say is, and this is a lesson learned after years in the trenches and probably violating this myself from time to time. Painful objectivity is truly an asset for an entrepreneur. When you start to disregard existential threats or trying to tell yourself that your product is going to sell itself, guess what? It isn't. It isn't at all. You got to be painfully objective about how you map out your plan, how you look at your financial model, and always be questioning that. And then always leave the hubris at the door. Listen to good advice. Always, when people are saying it doesn't sound like what you're saying makes any sense, find out why they're saying it. They may be wrong, but listen. And I think that that'll help you go pretty far.
Don, if I may, I mean, one of the favorite parts I have of my day of working with entrepreneurs is they see constraints as opportunities, right, to problem solve around. So while I agree with everything you said, I think it's that this having a foot steeped in reality and a foot steeped in what the aspiration could be, and trying to close the gap between those things, right? And not, yes, absolutely be coachable, absolutely listen to what people are saying, but you're an entrepreneur because you think you are thinking hopefully differently about how to solve a problem than somebody else has before.
Perfect.
Right.
Well, just want to thank you both for joining us. You know, this conversation was part of what we hope was an announcement around applications for a virtual startup competition around IoT Solutions World Congress on October 5th. Deadlines for submissions are going to be June 30th. And we'll ultimately select teams by July 15th. Those teams are going to get a lot of resources around for the partners, but our three organizations, specifically stage 1 startups that have a minimum viable product, we'll be looking at 9 months free membership at Chicago's leading innovation centers with virtual platform access and hands-on mentorship. And then stage 2 startups, looking at companies that are ready to scale and commercialize, further support. In total, we're going to select 5 teams in each stages to participate in the virtual competition, with the winner announced by October. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to receiving your submissions and evaluating it and ultimately selecting a winner.
Thanks, Haven. Thanks, Don.
Have a great day, everyone.